Hi, my name is Jayreid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California, and today I'm going to conclude a two-part series on narcissistic rage. Today's emphasis will be not on the psychology of the narcissist who gets enraged and expresses his or her rage, but rather on the recipients of such rage, with particular attention to children who have endured narcissistic rage from one or more parents. The focus will be on the strategies of freeze and submit in the face of such rage, and how valuable those two strategies can be to survive a childhood with a narcissistic parent, and the importance in adulthood and sort of in recovery from narcissistic abuse of appreciating the value of those two responses, rather than feeling adversarial towards those responses within oneself, particularly when they may get triggered in the course of adult life. And I believe that it is in the course of that reframing from adversarial to appreciative of these responses that significant gains are made in the recovery from this form of prolonged childhood abuse. So, in the prior video, I really tried to walk through what can set off a bout of narcissistic rage with an understanding of the psychology of the narcissistic person. Now, with that in hand, or having seen it or perhaps read the blog, I'd like to address the responses that the victim has, often the scapegoated child has available to him or her in the face of those bouts of rage. Evolution would say, and other trauma theorists would say, that we have at least 4 sort of hardwired responses to traumatic stressors. And narcissistic rage would certainly qualify as a traumatic stressor in the sense that it overwhelms the organism's abilities to cope in the moments upon which it's occurring. That is very much true of narcissistic rage. The other feature of psychological trauma when it occurs in a relationship is that the person perpetuating the trauma, in this case the narcissistic parent, does it without regard to the feelings of the child in this case. And that is certainly true sort of in general of how the narcissistic parent operates for the child, but particularly so when that parent is raging at the child. So in the face of this, the parent is likely screaming, accusing the child of terrible things, being selfish, no good, disrespectful, whatever the sort of character assassination flavor is of that rage bout. Importantly so, the child, particularly the child who's been put into the role of scapegoat, has no escape valve. There's nobody to turn to say, hey, I don't like how this is making me feel. The child is utterly and completely alone in facing this rage. So I think it can be useful to think of our 4 hardwired responses to these kinds of threats or traumatic stresses along 2 dimensions. The first dimension is what are the odds of victory if one were to fight, and or what are the odds of escape if one were to flee? And then the other dimension, I like to think of it as sort of like on a Y and an X axis. And on the other axis, the other dimension would be how permanent is the threat? If you're walking in the woods and you see a bear coming at you, that's a low permanence of threat. You don't live amongst bears, you probably can get home and the ordeal will be over so long as you can escape. But if you're a child of, say, a narcissistic parent prone to rage, the permanence of that threat is quite high. So back to the 4 responses, we have the fight response. And I would submit to people here that that trauma response gets invoked when there's a high odds of victory and there's a low permanence of threat. So in the case of, one is walking down the street and gets accosted by, say, someone who's looks to be on drugs and wants to take their wallet. They maybe don't have any weapon on them, and say this individual in this example is trained in self-defense. And, in those cases, the odds of victory are high, you could argue, and the permanence of threat is low. This is just someone off the street who's accosting our, imagined person here. So if they invoke the fight response, it would make sense. There'd be a quick appraisal of the situation, and that might be in the person's best interest to do. Let's say, in contrast, that same sort of drug-fueled person does appear to have a weapon, but is, say, heavy-set, doesn't appear to be able to run very fast, and our imagined person is a former college sprinter. Well, sure, then the flight response makes a ton of sense, and that is likely to be invoked. Now, though, let's say the odds of victory or in a fight or odds of successful escape if one were to flee are low. Then we can't really do this kind of I'm on the street thing. Let's go into a family home where there's a narcissistic parent and a child whom that parent has kind of deemed as his victim, who he's going to point to and blame for any time he feels threatened in his sense of sort of inflated superiority. In this case, the odds of, certainly the odds of escape or victory in a fight are low, if not zero. The permanence of the threat is from middle ground to quite high, and in those two cases, the trauma response of freeze, where in essence one just sort of stops themselves and just lets the threat hopefully sort of do its damage and keep on going. The value of this response to a traumatic aggressor or to the aggressor is that by not putting up a struggle, it can sort of indicate that they've accomplished the goal that they're seeking to accomplish, perhaps with minimizing damage that might otherwise be inflicted. I think a great example of this is antelopes on the plains of Africa. If they get attacked by a lion or a tiger, and the tiger, let's say, catches them, they will go into this sort of freeze, sort of playing dead response where they get often drugged back to where the lion or tiger wants to keep them. And maybe then when the lion is convinced that the antelope is dead, the lion may go out and try to hunt for a new prey or go and get his fellow lions to come enjoy his kill. And if enough distance is gained, and there's footage of this, the antelope will actually come to life and gently get up and start shaking to sort of restore themselves back to life and go run off and join the herd. But it's by virtue of that shutting down and that freeze that they're able to ensure their survival. And that has a lot of carryover in surviving a narcissist rage, where, as we've talked about before, there's no talking back to, no clearing up any misunderstanding. It just is something to be endured. And to that extent, going into the freeze mode where one is not offering resistance can sort of make it at times something that the narcissist kind of loses interest in. It's not a willing combatant where they maybe get to satiate that lust to really pulverize an opponent. It's like the opponent's already sort of said, you win, and they may just sort of move on. The fourth response is the submit response, and that is certainly most rationally kind of used to survive when the threat of, the permanence of the threat is extremely high, like a narcissistic parent, and there's virtually no odds of victory or successful flight from the threat, which is the case typically with a narcissistic parent, particularly a narcissistic parent who's curated an image of being a perfect parent to everyone outside the doors, of the household, which unfortunately is often the case. In those cases, figuring out ways to kind of be in a submissive pose to the parent can both reduce the frequency of their narcissistic rages because they feel less challenged in their sort of inflated sense of their own authority. In essence, from the last video, their sense of entitlement, they get to feel like the child is complying with that much more often. And then two, once the bout is set off, it can allow the child's main concern to be how to get back into the parent's graces and take on whatever the parent is accusing them of being in an effort to restore the parent's goodwill. And of course, the parent's goodwill depends on the child saying, yes, I am as bad as you say I am. The invocation of the submit sort of mode of being can be very useful in that. And again, it's so important to really appreciate how valuable the submit and the freeze response are for children who were victimized by a narcissistic parent. It's, I believe, strongly to the child's credit, they were able to invoke and consistently apply this. Now, I think one thing that often happens in having to repeatedly and consistently utilize these two ways of responding is that they kind of often tend to inform one's growing sense of who they are as a person in the world. And in addition, letting them inform one's sense of who one is in the world is also quite adaptive. It's not without some sort of practice or effort that one becomes able to readily get into a freeze or a submit response. Particularly as, say, the child of a narcissist is growing up, getting physically bigger, getting more mentally facile and perceptive. It takes effort to sort of dampen those growing capacities down so as not to further threaten the narcissistic parent. And one thing that is very, I think, useful to achieve that end is adopting beliefs that hasten the freeze or the submit response. And beliefs tend to be very self-diminishing beliefs, ones that often come with feelings of shame, self-loathing, self-hatred. As hard as it is to sort of talk about those beliefs and to suggest that someone would sort of adopt them, I think it's important to see them as potential means towards the end of getting to the freeze or submit stances with the narcissistic parent. In treatment, a lot of important progress gets made where we get to reframe why maybe this survivor holds such, let's say, self-diminishing beliefs about themselves, in that it's not because they're sort of lacking self-esteem as though it's some sort of character flaw or deficit, but rather it was a very ingenious way to manage one's psychology to minimize what would have otherwise been potentially not survivable damage inflicted by their narcissistic parent, at least in some cases where the parent was in fact quite malignant and even sadistic in how punitive they were when any sort of threat was perceived to their sense of false superiority. When that reframe really gets to take hold, it's just a very powerful pivoting that happens where there's a stronger empathic connection with oneself and appreciation and respect for oneself and what one had to do to get there, even though, importantly, that these kinds of beliefs have made, in essence, it mandatory to live without a sense of self-respect. And that's sort of the, conundrum in a way of this all, is that, it can feel like it's the beliefs, the problem is that the person has the belief that makes it feel like they don't have respect for themselves. But in fact, the belief was designed to not give oneself a conscious feeling of self-respect, because the real problem is that you had someone in authority who had a permanent threat, who there was no hope to flee or fight, who was targeting any signs of self-respect, because they would have seen that as a threat to their own very fragile ability to hold themselves in high regard. I'm talking about the narcissistic parent. As all these things get fleshed out, I think it's sort of like an organic kind of turn back to a sense of respect for oneself, but also respect for what one did in invoking the submit and freeze responses. It's often hard won and requires some time in therapy and good healthy relationships, or just good healthy relationships. I don't think therapy is by any means the only means to get to this point, but it's a very, very it's one that is well worth the effort, and I think can be very much in the either immediate or long-term future for survivors of narcissistic parents. This appreciation, as opposed to sort of adversarialness towards beliefs that helped invoke the freeze and submit responses. I should add, what are these kinds of beliefs? These are beliefs like, I'm defective, I don't deserve others' reciprocal care or attention, my needs are not as important as others, I don't deserve to feel happy if others aren't happy as well. All these things that sort of constrict one from sort of feeling fully and rightly themselves are the kinds of beliefs that can often make it easier to adopt the freeze or the submit responses. Well, thanks for your time and attention here today. I hope it's been useful in kind of thinking through the genesis of narcissistic rage in the parent and what the kid often has to do to get through it, and how that can be shifted into a real as something that can really be valued, that the kid was able to do in order to get through the very, very terrible threat they faced. Thank you, and I hope everyone is as safe in all senses as can be these days, and I look forward to posting another video soon.